Picture this: dense green jungle, dripping with humidity, alive with the sounds of insects and parrots. Beneath the canopy, young Marines crawl through mud that clings to their boots like glue. It is late 1942 on Guadalcanal, and America's first great test against Japan's ground forces is underway. For the Japanese, trained in island warfare and hardened by campaigns in China, this should have been familiar territory. Yet what they encountered in the Solomon Islands was unlike anything they had imagined. Every shadow concealed danger. Every rustle in the foliage carried the possibility of death. For the Americans, Guadalcanal was not just a battlefield. It was a crucible. These Marines had been hurled into an environment as hostile as the enemy they faced. Malaria buzzed through the night, dysentery spread through the camps, and food supplies often ran low. But the Japanese soon discovered that their enemy would not be broken by jungle fever or starvation. Instead, the Marines adapted. They dug into the earth, laid ambushes on narrow trails, and turned the terrain into a weapon. Halfway through this brutal campaign, a realization began to dawn on the Japanese infantry. The Americans fought differently. Their fire discipline, their use of automatic rifles like the Browning automatic rifle, and their coordination in small units turned dense jungle into killing zones. Entire patrols of Japanese soldiers were cut down before they could even fire a shot. The old assumption that American troops were soft, lacking in spirit, crumbled in the mud of Guadalcanal. What makes this story even more striking is how quickly the balance of morale shifted. The Japanese had landed believing in their superiority, buoyed by victories across Asia. But night after night, they found themselves stalked, ambushed, and shattered by young Americans who refused to yield. The jungle itself seemed to side with the Marines, who had learned to move silently, to use flares and grenades to shatter enemy formations. And before we go further, if you want more untold stories of impossible odds, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because what comes next will change how you see the Pacific War forever. The story of Guadalcanal was not just about men with rifles. It was about the birth of an American way of war that horrified Japan. At the center of Guadalcanal's struggle stood a strip of dirt and coral known as Henderson Field. By day, it was a hive of noise, bulldozers roaring, aircraft engines shrieking, Marines dragging supplies through muck. By night, it became the most contested patch of earth in the Pacific. Whoever controlled Henderson controlled the skies, and by extension, the fate of the island. For the Japanese, the existence of Henderson was an intolerable insult. Their soldiers called it the airfield of death, because every attempt to seize it ended in slaughter. Under the relentless cover of American aircraft, Japanese convoys were shredded before they could deliver reinforcements. Troops marching through jungle trails were strafed by P-400 Airacobras or Navy Wildcats. Even at night, the sound of American bombers rumbling overhead robbed Japanese soldiers of sleep, a constant reminder that their enemy held the initiative. The defenders of Henderson Field were not just pilots and mechanics. They were Marines who transformed the perimeter into a fortress. Barbed wire tangled through the trees, foxholes lined the edges of clearings, and machine gun nests covered every approach. Japanese infantry, trained in lightning assaults and infiltration tactics, repeatedly hurled themselves at these defenses. The results were catastrophic. Assault after assault collapsed under the combined weight of artillery fire, automatic weapons, and well-timed counterattacks. What stunned the Japanese was not merely the strength of the defenses, but the ferocity of the men behind them. Marines fought with a desperation born of necessity, often repelling attackers in brutal hand-to-hand combat when ammunition ran low. Henderson became a graveyard where bayonets, grenades, and even shovels were used as weapons in the darkness. Survivors spoke of the eerie silence that followed each failed assault, broken only by the cries of the wounded echoing through the jungle. The psychological toll was immense. Japanese units that had marched confidently into the island were reduced to shadows of themselves. Soldiers wrote home describing Guadalcanal as a place where spirits vanished, where even veterans felt helpless. For many, Henderson Field symbolized the nightmare of American jungle warfare, a reminder that their opponent could not be dislodged, no matter how much blood was spilled. The battle for this airstrip revealed a truth Japan had never considered. America would not fight a conventional war, but one that fused endurance, ingenuity, and relentless pressure until the enemy broke. When the sun set on Guadalcanal, the island transformed into a realm of terror. Japanese commanders believed the cover of darkness would turn the tide. Night fighting was their specialty, honed in years of warfare across Asia. They were confident that under the jungle canopy, with bayonets fixed and voices silenced, they could infiltrate marine lines and overwhelm the defenders. But what they encountered was something far more chilling than expected. Marines adapted quickly. They set up listening posts deep in the thickets, tripwires strung between tree trunks, and flares ready to ignite the night sky in bursts of white light. When Japanese troops crept forward, they suddenly found themselves blinded, exposed, and cut down by machine guns already zeroed in on the approach paths. The Americans turned the Japanese doctrine of stealth into a trap. The Knights of Guadalcanal became infamous for the intensity of their combat. The Japanese launched waves of banzai charges, shouting into the darkness, their silhouettes charging through muzzle flashes. Yet instead of breaking the lines, these attacks were shredded by overlapping fields of fire. Marines fired until their rifle barrels glowed red, then picked up enemy weapons to keep fighting. Many battles devolved into close-quarters clashes, knives, entrenching tools, even bare fists deciding who lived until dawn. For Japanese soldiers, the horror lay not just in the losses, but in the realization that their legendary night tactics no longer guaranteed victory. American units, supported by artillery positioned around Henderson Field, responded to night attacks with terrifying barrages. Shells exploded through the jungle canopy, turning trees into splinters and scattering attackers in chaos. Survivors recalled the ground shaking beneath them, the sky lit as if by lightning, the smell of cordite hanging in the air long after the firing ceased. By morning, the carnage was visible in clearings littered with discarded rifles and broken helmets. Japanese commanders urged their men to redouble efforts, but the pattern remained the same. Attack in the dark, suffer devastating casualties, retreat into the jungle. The myth of invincibility eroded with each failed assault. These night battles demonstrated a crucial lesson. America's fighting men were not only resilient, but also resourceful, capable of turning their enemies' strengths against them. The Japanese had expected to dominate the darkness. Instead, they found it had become their tomb. Beyond bullets and bayonets, another enemy stalked the Japanese troops on Guadalcanal: hunger. The island's thick jungle and unpredictable climate made resupply nearly impossible. American aircraft from Henderson Field patrolled the skies relentlessly, striking at barges, transports, and any vessel daring to approach the island. Convoys meant to deliver rice, ammunition, and medicine were shattered in daylight raids, their wreckage washing ashore as a grim reminder of isolation. By late 1942, Japanese soldiers were reduced to eating roots, coconuts, and whatever they could scavenge from the jungle floor. Some resorted to raiding American garbage dumps under the cover of night, risking death for scraps. Letters and diaries from captured troops describe bodies weakening, eyes hollow, and spirits collapsing. Malnutrition, combined with malaria and dysentery, ravaged entire battalions. Thousands were rendered unfit for combat long before they ever reached the front lines. The Americans also suffered from the island's unforgiving environment, but they had something the Japanese lacked: a steady flow of supplies. Convoys from the U.S. Navy delivered food, medical equipment, and reinforcements. Even when ships were lost in night battles along the Slot, replacements soon followed. Canned rations, quinine tablets, and fresh troops kept the Marines standing, while their opponents withered away. The disparity shocked Japanese commanders. They had underestimated America's ability to sustain a campaign thousands of miles from its shores. The belief that American forces would falter without immediate victory collapsed under the weight of Guadalcanal's reality. The longer the campaign dragged on, the more the jungle itself became America's ally, weakening the enemy from within. Starvation changed the very psychology of Japanese units. Once proud regiments, known for their discipline, became fragmented. Soldiers too weak to carry rifles were left behind. Some men simply vanished into the trees, succumbing quietly to disease and exhaustion. For those who pressed on, the sight of Americans well-fed and well-armed was devastating to morale. In the end, Guadalcanal was as much a war of endurance as of firepower. Hunger hollowed out Japan's ranks, leaving them shadows of the elite warriors who had marched confidently onto the island. The jungle did not just hide American ambushes. It drained Japanese strength day by day until even the strongest could no longer fight. At the heart of Guadalcanal's struggle stood a single strip of land carved from the jungle, the airfield the Japanese had begun but never finished. Renamed Henderson Field by the Marines, it became the most fiercely contested piece of ground in the Pacific. Whoever held it controlled the skies, and by extension the island itself. From its muddy runways, American F-4F Wildcats and SBD Dauntless dive bombers launched daily strikes. Their presence disrupted Japanese attempts to bring reinforcements across the treacherous waters, nicknamed Ironbottom Sound, where wrecks of ships and aircraft piled up with each clash. The Japanese Navy, still powerful, attempted daring runs under the cover of night, unloading men and supplies in what became known as the Tokyo Express. But daylight always brought retribution. Henderson's planes hunted down retreating ships, making each resupply run costlier than the last. For the Marines, defending Henderson was a matter of survival. Every Japanese offensive, whether by artillery shelling, aerial bombing, or ground assault, was ultimately aimed at destroying or seizing the airfield. Yet time and again, the Americans held firm. Trenches, sandbag positions, and makeshift revetments turned the area into a fortress. Exhausted engineers kept the runway patched under fire, ensuring aircraft could still take off even after bombardments cratered the field. The Japanese understood its significance. Without Henderson, their troops on the island were stranded, starved, and outmatched. But taking it proved impossible. The Americans, supplied with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, transformed the airfield into a symbol of persistence. Even as malaria spread through the ranks and casualties mounted, the men guarding Henderson knew that losing it meant losing Guadalcanal. The psychological weight of Henderson Field was immense. Japanese soldiers advancing through the jungle could hear the distant drone of American engines overhead, a constant reminder that they were under watch. Each sortie reminded them that the enemy's strength only grew, while theirs dwindled. For Japanese pilots, missions over Henderson became near suicidal, with losses piling up against disciplined American defenses. By November 1942, Henderson Field was more than an airstrip. It was the pivot point of the Pacific War. Holding it meant the Americans had secured a permanent foothold in the Solomon Islands. Failing to capture it meant Japan's hopes of regaining the initiative were slipping away, one desperate attack at a time. Night after night, Japanese destroyers dashed down the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands, unloading men and supplies before racing back to safer waters. This desperate resupply effort earned the nickname Tokyo Express, and while it demonstrated the bravery and seamanship of Japanese crews, it also revealed the limits of their strategy. Each run delivered only a fraction of what was needed to sustain their hungry, malaria-stricken troops ashore. American forces, bolstered by intelligence intercepts and the vigilance of coast watchers hidden on surrounding islands, began predicting these runs with growing accuracy. When the Japanese destroyers charged through Ironbottom Sound, U.S. cruisers and PT boats waited in ambush. Searchlights pierced the dark waters, guns roared, and the night seas glowed with burning wreckage. Ironbottom Sound earned its name from the twisted hulks settling on the seafloor, Japanese and American alike. The contrast in logistics was stark. America's industrial might meant supplies arrived on sturdy transports and escort carriers, guarded by fleets of destroyers and cruisers. Even under threat of submarine attack or air assault, the Americans could deliver food, ammunition, and reinforcements in volumes the Japanese could not hope to match. While the Tokyo Express could move fast, it could never deliver enough. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal felt the effects immediately, resorting to roots, insects, and whatever they could scavenge to survive. Many died not from bullets, but from hunger. The sea battles waged around these runs were some of the most chaotic of the Pacific War. Radar-equipped American ships gained an edge in the darkness, while Japanese commanders relied on daring night tactics honed before the war. At times, the Tokyo Express inflicted serious damage, even sinking U.S. cruisers. But each victory came at a heavy cost, as Japan lost more ships and seasoned sailors they could not replace. For the men stranded in the jungle, every failed run spelled despair. Starvation gnawed at their strength, disease sapped their will, and constant American artillery fire broke their morale. Survivors would later recall the haunting sight of comrades collapsing mid-march, too weak to continue. The jungle became a silent killer, and the Tokyo Express could not outrun it. By late 1942, the Express was a lifeline fraying under relentless pressure. Each voyage carried more risk than reward, and with every ship sunk in the black waters of Ironbottom Sound, Japan's hold on Guadalcanal weakened irreversibly. The waters around Guadalcanal became the stage for some of the most brutal naval engagements in modern history. Unlike the sweeping battles fought in daylight, these were sudden, violent clashes under the cloak of night, where chaos reigned and survival depended on instinct as much as strategy. Both navies understood the stakes. Control of the seas determined whether Henderson Field could be supplied or starved. The Japanese Navy, renowned for its night-fighting skill, initially outmaneuvered American ships with devastating torpedo attacks. The infamous Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, carrying nearly 1,100 pounds of explosives, could reach farther and hit harder than anything in the American arsenal. Entire U.S. cruisers were sent to the bottom in sudden flashes of fire, their crews fighting desperately to escape the burning wreckage. For the Americans, these early encounters were humbling, proving the Japanese were still a force to be feared. But the U.S. fleet adapted quickly. Radar, a technology the Japanese lacked, became their equalizer. American destroyers learned to detect enemy ships before visual contact, striking first with gunfire and torpedoes. The nighttime brawls grew more balanced, and eventually tilted in favor of the U.S. Navy. The cost, however, was staggering. Ironbottom Sound became a graveyard for both fleets, its depths littered with shattered hulls and silent crews who never returned home. Among the fiercest clashes was the naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, a multi-day struggle involving carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. At its peak, even the mighty Japanese battleship Hiei was crippled and later sunk, while American ships like the USS Atlanta paid with their lives to keep Henderson Field safe. Sailors who fought there described the night as a storm of fire, smoke, and confusion, where friend and foe were nearly indistinguishable. For Japanese commanders, the battles highlighted a grim reality. Even when they inflicted serious damage, they could not keep pace with America's ability to replace lost ships and trained crews. Every American vessel lost was soon replaced. Every Japanese loss left a hole that could never be filled. By the end of these naval clashes, the balance of power had shifted. Japan had bled heavily, losing irreplaceable ships and officers, while the United States proved its resilience. The seas around Guadalcanal, once dominated by Japan, were slipping from their grasp, an omen of the wider war's trajectory. While naval battles raged offshore, the jungle itself became a battlefield every bit as lethal. For Japanese troops, who had been drilled in aggressive assault tactics, Guadalcanal's dense terrain was a nightmare. Towering trees blocked visibility, vines tangled equipment, and every step seemed to conceal an ambush. The Americans, learning quickly from bitter encounters, adapted their style of fighting into what became known as jungle warfare. Small Marine patrols moved silently along muddy trails, cutting paths with machetes and keeping their senses sharp for any movement in the foliage. Snipers perched in hidden nests, machine guns were positioned to cover likely approaches, and mortars provided quick bursts of devastating firepower. At night, the jungle was alive with eerie sounds. Rustling leaves, distant cries, and sudden bursts of gunfire. Sleep became rare, as both sides launched raids designed to keep their enemies off balance. For Japanese soldiers, the psychological toll was immense. They were trained to fight in set-piece battles where bravery and spirit could turn the tide. But in Guadalcanal's wilderness, they faced an enemy who was patient, methodical, and relentless. Japanese accounts later described the terror of creeping forward only to trigger a hidden American position, where flamethrowers, grenades, and close-range gunfire ripped through their ranks. The jungle, which they had assumed would shield them, betrayed them instead. Disease compounded their misery. Malaria, dysentery, and jungle rot spread unchecked among Japanese units with little access to medicine. Already weakened by starvation from failed supply efforts, men wasted away. In contrast, though American troops also suffered heavily from illness, their logistical advantage meant quinine, food, and medical supplies arrived regularly enough to sustain their fighting capability. The brutality of close combat left lasting scars. Marines recalled the sharp smell of decaying vegetation, mixing with that of the dead. The silence after firefights broken only by insects buzzing over fallen men. The Japanese, bound by the Bushido Code, rarely surrendered. This forced the Americans into a mindset where mercy was seldom possible. The fighting became personal, raw, and primal, one side determined to dig in, the other desperate to break through. By late 1942, it was clear the jungle had become an ally to the Americans and an executioner for the Japanese. Their troops, once considered among the best in the world, were now trapped in a hostile environment that consumed their strength day by day. Guadalcanal's wilderness was no longer just terrain. It was a weapon. By the final months of the Guadalcanal campaign, the Japanese High Command faced a truth they had long resisted. Their soldiers were being consumed not only by American firepower, but by the slow, crushing weight of attrition. Starvation, disease, and relentless pressure had reduced once proud regiments into shattered remnants. Officers reported men collapsing on marches, too weak to stand, their bodies skeletal, their eyes hollow with hunger. What had begun as a bold offensive turned into a struggle for survival. American forces, meanwhile, grew stronger. Fresh units rotated in, bringing supplies, heavy artillery, and more aircraft for Henderson Field. Each new arrival demonstrated the vast gulf between Japan's strained logistics and America's seemingly endless capacity to reinforce. For Japanese soldiers hiding in foxholes or preparing night raids, the realization was unavoidable. The enemy was not wearing down. He was growing. Morale plummeted across the Japanese lines. Survivors recalled desperate scenes of comrades boiling leather straps for food, scouring the jungle for roots, and even eating insects to stay alive. Many became too weak to fight, succumbing without a shot fired. Commanders, once confident in the invincibility of their warriors, now faced impossible choices: throw starving men into hopeless charges or watch them waste away in silence. For American troops, the shift was visible. Patrols encountered less resistance, and when firefights erupted, Japanese attacks lacked their former coordination and intensity. Yet there was no joy in witnessing an enemy unravel. Marines spoke of encountering gaunt, fevered soldiers who fought with a kind of desperate fury born not from strategy, but from knowing their end was near. The jungle floor became a graveyard, littered with discarded rifles and personal belongings left by men too weak to carry them. The Japanese command still hoped for a decisive naval engagement to turn the tide, but those dreams faded with each lost ship and downed aircraft. Guadalcanal had become a symbol of futility, a place where Japan's tactical brilliance could not overcome its lack of resources. Even Yamamoto himself, orchestrator of earlier victories, would concede that the campaign drained their strength faster than they could replenish it. By January 1943, whispers of withdrawal began circulating among Japanese staff. The empire that had swept through Asia with terrifying speed was now contemplating retreat. For its soldiers still trapped on the island, the once unthinkable truth loomed closer each day. Guadalcanal was lost. When the Japanese finally ordered a withdrawal in February 1943, they framed it as a tactical decision. But history recognized it for what it was: Japan's first major defeat on land during World War II. The retreat marked not just the loss of an island, but the shattering of an aura of invincibility that had cloaked their forces since Pearl Harbor. Guadalcanal exposed the cracks in their war machine, logistics too fragile, supply lines too thin, and an enemy with industrial might far greater than they had anticipated. For the Americans, victory at Guadalcanal carried meaning beyond the battlefield. It was proof that U.S. forces could face Japan's best and prevail. The lessons learned in jungle warfare, night naval battles, and coordinated air-ground-sea operations became the foundation for campaigns yet to come. Veterans of Guadalcanal would later fight at Tarawa, Saipan, and Leyte Gulf, carrying hard-earned knowledge into every clash. The toll, however, was steep. Nearly 7,000 Americans died, and countless more were wounded or scarred by disease. For the Japanese, losses were far worse. Over 30,000 men killed, starved, or left behind. Ironbottom Sound remained a watery tomb for sailors of both nations, a reminder of the ferocity that defined the campaign. Survivors on each side carried memories of nights filled with tracer fire, the stench of the jungle, and the unshakable sound of engines over Henderson Field. Guadalcanal's legacy also reshaped strategy at the highest levels. Japan shifted to a defensive posture, trying to hold territory rather than expand. The United States, emboldened by its success, began the long island-hopping offensive, inching closer to Japan's home islands with every victory. The tide of war had turned, and the momentum was now firmly in American hands. Yet beneath the grand strategies and historical milestones lies the human dimension. Letters from Marines spoke of fear, exhaustion, and the bond forged in shared hardship. Japanese diaries revealed despair, honor, and resignation in the face of certain defeat. Both sides shed blood in a hostile environment that spared no one, binding Guadalcanal forever as a chapter written in sacrifice. The campaign ended, but its echoes endure. Guadalcanal was where Japan's expansion met its limit, and America's path to victory truly began. It was not just an island, it was the place where the Pacific War's future was decided.